For decades, Ghana stood as a model of democratic stability and economic growth in West Africa. It was a middle-income country that played by the rules of the global financial system. But its economic engine was built on a narrow base. Ghana relied heavily on the export of raw materials, specifically cocoa, gold, and later oil, to generate the vast majority of its foreign exchange earnings. Because the country never fully diversified its industries, government remained directly tethered to the volatile price swings of these global commodities. If the global market dipped, Ghana's national budget absorbed the shock. This chart shows the danger of that exposure. While commodity revenues flatlined, the government covered its spending gap by turning to international capital markets, taking on a sharply rising curve of commercial Eurobond debt. That borrowing was not cheap. Because of what economists call the African risk premium, a systemic penalty applied to developing nations, Ghana was forced to borrow at aggressive, punishing interest rates, driving up the long-term cost of that debt. Underneath its strong democratic institutions and rich natural resources, the country had constructed an economy that could only survive under perfect global conditions. Then, those conditions shattered. The COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war violently disrupted global supply chains that Ghana depended on. In 2022, the macroeconomic fallout hit the domestic market. The Ghanaian Cedi lost roughly half of its value against the US dollar in a matter of months. Looking at the trajectory of consumer prices, this chart shows inflation surging to a devastating peak of 54.1% by the end of December 2022. By this point, total public debt had reached 90% of Ghana's GDP. As this proportional chart illustrates, the cost of simply servicing that debt expanded so aggressively that interest payments alone consumed a massive portion of all government revenue collected. The math no longer worked. On December 19, 2022, the Ministry of Finance halted payments on most of its external, commercial, and bilateral debt. This announcement marked a formal sovereign default. Overnight, Ghana was locked out of international capital markets. A disruption in global supply chains metastasized into total state insolvency, threatening the stability of one of the continent's most resilient democracies. To secure a $3 billion rescue package from the International Monetary Fund, the government first had to balance its books at home. It launched the Domestic Debt Exchange Program, a sweeping fiscal operation targeting 137.3 billion cedis in government bonds held by local banks, pension funds, and individual citizens. This chart breaks down the exchange. The government didn't erase the principal owed, but slashed coupon yields to absolute zero for 2023. Those yields stepped up marginally to 5% in 2024 and 10% from 2025 onwards, severely delaying investor returns. This operation effectively forced local institutions and citizens to absorb the immediate cost of the state's insolvency, stripping liquidity from the domestic market. The financial damage extended to the highest levels of the state. The Bank of Ghana itself absorbed massive losses on its government securities, pushing the central bank into a negative equity of 65.4 billion cedis. The process of stabilizing the nation's credit internationally required draining the balance sheets of the very domestic institutions the government was designed to protect. Only after this domestic fiscal surgery was executed did the IMF formally approve the extended credit facility in May 2023. The bailout came with strict mandates. The central bank was legally barred from providing monetary financing to the government. Furthermore, the Fiscal Responsibility Act was reinstated, legally capping the deficit at 5% of GDP. With the IMF on board, Ghana still had to face its external creditors to negotiate the restructuring of $13.1 billion in commercial Eurobonds. This visual represents the final terms reached with those private bondholders. It required a physical, nominal haircut, erasing 37% of the total debt mass. Meanwhile, official bilateral debts were funneled through the G20 Common Framework, an international mechanism organizing negotiations between the Paris Club nations and creditors like China. While local citizens took immediate, non-negotiable financial losses within months, the international restructuring process dragged on through a slow, deeply fragmented web of creditor committees. By mid-2025, the data showed early signs of stabilization. Inflation dropped back into the low 20s, and the national economic growth rate began to rebound. As illustrated here, the national debt burden also contracted significantly. Ghana's debt-to-GDP ratio fell from 61.8% at the end of 2024, dropping to 43.8%. The focus of the IMF program has now shifted from emergency triage to implementing a technical assistance framework meant to build long-term institutional resilience. Yet, resolving the crisis revealed deep systemic flaws. When tested by the reality of a sovereign default, the global debt resolution machinery stalled entirely. The G20 Common Framework proved agonizingly slow, struggling to coordinate the competing interests of Paris Club members, Chinese state lenders, and private commercial bondholders. Occurring alongside similar crises in Zambia and Sri Lanka, Ghana's arduous negotiations demonstrated that the current architecture for resolving sovereign debt is inefficient and fractured. Because the international mechanisms cannot act swiftly or cohesively, the immediate burden of restructuring inevitably falls on the citizens of emerging economies. Until the global financial safety net is repaired, vulnerable nations will continue to pay a devastating domestic price for systemic international failures.